Hello. This has been such a great conference. I know that there are 700 scientists who came, and I sent an email to somebody back home saying 700 scientists, and I swear 600 of them are in their 30s. It's so exciting to see this infusion of eagerness and brilliance into this field, and it reminds me of the sustainable agriculture conferences I've gone to in the United States. You know, many people talk about the aging of the agricultural population, but there is this influx of new, young, brilliant agriculturalists, and I keep wishing I could see the young scientists here and those young agriculturalists get together, because I think that would be really world-changing. So we have a great panel today. I'll begin by bringing up Pia Bucella. She is the Director in charge of Natural Capital in DG Environment, European Commission. Her current responsibilities include development and implementation of the strategy and policies that serve to protect and enhance biodiversity and to promote better understanding of the value of biodiversity to our society through the Natura 2000 network, the Habitat and Birds directives. She is also involved in the integration and development of strategies and policies for agriculture, forestry, soil, and nitrates. Her previous task in the environmental department included the management of the Directorate of Legal Affairs and environmental integration in the cohesion policy, as well as the TENS. She was also responsible for developing the European Disaster Preparedness and Response System. So take a seat. Next, I'd like to introduce Francois Houllier, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of INRA, the French Institute for Agricultural Research, that produces scientific knowledge while working for economic and social innovation in the areas of food, agriculture, and the environment. Within the latter two areas, major research topics of INRA include agroecology and the related sustainable management of the soils. Thank you for coming. And next, I'd like to introduce Cyril Cow, who is the head of the Department of Research, Innovation, and International Cooperation of the General Directorate for Education and Research. The French Ministry of Agriculture launched in 2012 the Agroecology Project in order to move agriculture beyond conflicting views on growth models and to ensure changes in agriculture and the agricultural and food processing industries are part of a forward-looking approach. This is an ambitious, inspirational project that aims to shift agriculture towards the objective of combining economic, environmental, and social performance. This is a dynamic founded on the strength of collective effort and the rich diversity of French regions, on innovation, and on the spread of new know-how. Maintaining and managing soil biodiversity is a key issue in any agroecology approach. Thank you, and join the others. And then I'd like to welcome back the previous speakers from this morning, Richard Bargett, who is a professor of ecology at the University of Manchester. His main research interest is the study of plant-soil interactions and their impact on nutrient cycling and plant community dynamics in natural and managed ecosystems. And Antonio Bispo, who is an agricultural engineer specializing in soil chemistry. He's now at France's Agency for the Environment and Energy Management and responsible for issues related to soil protection. And Ben Delbert supervises daily operations in the program areas for the European Center for Nature Conservation, an NGO working for the conservation and sustainable use of Europe's nature, biodiversity, and landscapes. And Michael Stocking, who is Emeritus Professor of International Development in the School of International Development at the University of East Anglia. Until recently, he was the head of the school and leader of the Natural Resources Group, teaching on environmental issues in developing countries. And Mike Swift is the former director of Tropical Soil Biology and Fertility Institute in Nairobi, an organization he helped form in 1984 with a group of agriculturalists and soil biologists. So this is a large and very impressive panel, and we will try to have a bit of a dialogue about some of these questions that have been raised throughout the conference, and especially in the statement prepared by the early career scientists. So in recent years, climate change and biodiversity conservation have become hot topics among the public, but usually when we hear about biodiversity, it's almost exclusively a discussion of the living systems above ground. Yet we know that soil health and soil biodiversity is tied to very big issues like climate change and food security. So how can scientists communicate the importance of soil biodiversity in ways that both inform the public and excite their imagination? And do you have any examples of how this has been done successfully? So I'll start with Richard Bargett, but it would be good if everybody could join in with that.
Okay, is that working? Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the question. Well, I think firstly, as I touched on in my own presentation and other people have talked about, there is actually a tremendous research effort that is looking into how soil communities respond to different global change phenomena, climate change, land use change, nitrogen deposition. And there is an increasing understanding. There are still big gaps, but there is an increasing understanding on how those organisms are involved in the processes at an ecosystem scale. So the knowledge is increasing. I think to actually communicate that, I mean, my job is as a researcher and also a teacher. So I obviously a teacher at university, and I always think, I mean, I've taught soil science now for 20 years or something, and from my experience, the way to get students interested is, this might be disappointing for people interested in particular organisms, but I think it's really to start with the bigger issues. I think if you can capture the attention of students, for example, in terms of global carbon cycling, and then you start to direct them to the soil, you identify the importance of the soil, and then the organisms in the soil afterwards, I think you can then actually captivate their interest. I think if you just start by talking about the diversity of organisms in the soil and how they respond to climate change, I think it's actually quite hard to communicate that. So I think for me, you have to start with the bigger concepts to actually grab their attention, in a similar way to, say, communicating the importance of medical sciences, etc., where you would probably talk about the actual diseases you were challenging. So to me, it's about addressing the big issues and then communicating the importance of the organisms within that. So I think once you actually capture their imagination, whether these are students or the general public, I think then their curiosity will feed that interest further.
Okay. Francois Houllier, you look like you have an idea.
Maybe first I would like to strongly support what has been said just now. I feel that if the soil scientist community focuses too much on soil diversity by itself, there is a risk that the people do not understand the role of the soils in the global picture. So I very much agree with what you said. I have the feeling that if there is a capability to express that the soil diversity has a role, for example, in the nitrogen cycle, the carbon cycle, that there are links with the climate issues, then there will be a sort of interest coming both from the students and also the population. One of the reasons being that if you compare the soil biodiversity, I may understand that there are people, for example, who are very much interested in earthworms or the columbola or other organisms, but somehow the competition with butterflies, with orchids, will always be to the detriment to these organisms that are in the soil. So if we want to somehow share the idea that soil diversity is interesting, I think we should enter into that topic through the major issues rather than through the beauty of the different organisms. It may be different for other types of organisms, other types of biodiversity. For example, there is a fascination for the people there is a fascination for the coral reef fishes, and there is a natural attraction or attractiveness of this topic. I think with the soil we have to do it in another way. Maybe another thing is that we should also speak in simple terms. Very often when you look when you read the abstracts of the papers, they are about the methods rather than about the results. We have done that and that using this and this technology and technique, rather than saying we have got these results. And I think this is another way to somehow attract the attention, to speak about what we have learned, what we know, rather than speaking about what we are doing and the way we do it.
Any other comments from the panel?
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And apologies if I address the issue from a different perspective. I would say that coming from my background, this being working at the European Commission in Brussels, I would consider that if we want to bring the soil biodiversity issues closer, I would first want to address, and this is somehow my daily business, the one community which is closest to soil, which is the farmers' community. I think that unless we bring the farmers on board, I have little chance to make an overall progress on soil biodiversity. And how can we bring farmers on board? Right now, and I think you may have heard about it on TV or read in newspapers, we are trying to find a good way out of the economic crisis, which strikes Europe, but not only, now for quite some years. And we consider that overall growth and jobs are really extremely important. And while some could think that this then excludes biodiversity issues, excludes research, excludes soils, what is our issue here today, this is simply not true, because we will not be able to have growth unless it is green growth, because without green growth, we will not have a sustainable growth. And here we come back to the big importance of soils, of their biodiversity, and of their capability to make up for good food, healthy food, with fewer costs in the end of the day, because you have fewer pesticides, you will have fewer pollution, and therefore we just can trust the soil to provide us with good food in the end.
I was interested in what Anthony said when you were speaking about there are these very successful farmers who are understanding soil biodiversity and raising food with few inputs, and how many scientists are going there to study what's happening on their land and study in that way, leaving the lab and looking at these very successful farmers who are somehow using these principles, somehow that they've either stumbled upon them but they are putting into practice a lot of the ideas that we've heard coming from the lab. How much of that is going on?
Well, in fact, I don't really know how many farmers have moved, but maybe the French Minister of Agriculture know more than I on that. But in fact, farmers very often look at other examples. Those farmers, those who I know, sometimes go to Brazil, go to Argentina to see fields or other practices. And then they import, they test, they fail, they retest, they refail, they retest, and they find solutions. But it works, but they don't really know how it works. So I think research can make profit of that. Let's say it's an experimental field for research. So I think we have to look at that and to not only to investigate control experiments, which are needed to control everything and to know the mechanisms behind, but also to go to real life situations and with the same tools to try to make connections and to increase our knowledge on that.
It was mentioned that scientific papers are often hard to understand and difficult to access. Is there a way to change that? And can scientists learn to write up their work in a way that they're not just explaining it to their colleagues, but that they're also presenting a window to the public so that the public can understand and policymakers can understand? Everybody could speak to that. How can scientists make their published work more accessible? Yeah, please.
I think we have an example just standing near us in this particular issue, or one aspect of it is that, okay, maybe those of us who are the scientists who are doing things or used to do things will not be immediately good at explaining in a non-scientific way what we want to get over to people. But there are many, many professional communicators around who can do that for us, and I think seeking them out and communicating with them is one way to go, because and of course we can learn ourselves from that experience as well. I remember always very vividly when one lunchtime my eldest son, who was then I suppose about 11 or 12, asked me a question, and then just as I was starting to reply, he said, "And don't say it depends what you mean by." And that well, you see, you know that's a scientist's response. Yes, but it's like this, but you know, also there's that there which is a bit different. So when we've done the next bit of research, we'll actually be able to tell you the answer to the question. And that's what sticks in the way, in some respects, not just the technical language, but the job of a scientist is to deal with uncertainty, and what people don't want to hear about is uncertainty. So use the professional communicator to help you to move on into being much more certain about what you say.
Yeah, I mean, I would, as a scientist, I would certainly agree with that as well. I think some people are better than others at communicating their work, and if people are very good at it in terms of writing or speaking, they should be encouraged to do that. And but I think one thing, as a scientist, you are trained to write as a scientist in a way to justify what you do in the way that Mike Smith's just been saying, and it's quite hard to depart from that in the way you write, to sort of not justify every comment, not give different caveats for the limitations in a statement. So it's actually quite challenging, I think, for scientists to make that step without sort of compromising what you say. Because, you know, when you draw a conclusion, you want that to be supported by scientific evidence. So I think that's a challenge. But having said that, certainly in the UK, and I'm sure in other countries, training in science communication is really embedded very early on in people's careers. And that, I mean, I never had any training whatsoever in that area, and you know, people at my age are it's probably too late to do that kind of thing. But I think now it is very much embedded in early training of PhD students, postdoctoral workers. So I think it's probably something that's going to improve in the future in terms of how people can be trained to communicate more effectively.
Mm-hmm. Ben, can you speak to this?
Yes, I was going to support that as well, actually. Indeed, intermediaries for communicating science can be used, and science communication in the curriculum of scientists, glad to hear that this is already happening. That would be definitely needed, I think. Perhaps also not just science communication, but also towards specific policy audience, for example, specific audiences. But I think what is an additional element in communication is that the recognition of scientists in terms of what they produce is, to my understanding, to a large extent based on scientific papers and scientific posters and what have you, whereas the actual impact on society in many countries is not taken into account into the impact of a scientist. So if you produce a policy brief, if you talk to a policymaker, for example, or to other practitioners, that's great that you do that, but it's not shown in the rating system, so to speak. And I think there's a long way to go still. For some countries, I know in the UK, this is happening. Impact on society is being included in measuring your effectiveness as a scientist, but that is not that common as far as I understand.
Please.
Yes, maybe one point and a link with this, the point by Antonio also. Communication means that there is an emission and a reception process. And I think we have to think about what kind of information we have to communicate for various people. Another point is practitioners. I think what kind of knowledge do we need? And knowledge is only in research. I think a lot of people say that there is also knowledge with practitioners and farmers and land users. We have to think about ways to make communications in both ways between researchers and land users and practitioners. To do a new kind of research is called transdisciplinarity, it's called research model 2. There is various ways to describe that, but it's important to think about communication with new ways to do research with practitioners and by pioneers and people testing new ways to do.
Anyone else?
Maybe as a reaction or as a complement to things that have been said. I very much agree and support what Cyril just said about the fact that if it's about communication, it's about interaction. And so then we have to consider different types of public. If we are in front of students, we already expressed the idea that it is important to tell them that soil diversity is important for global issues. It could be also very interesting for some students to tell them that this is that there is a very lively scientific community and that there are scientific challenges which are incredible. For example, it is being said that the soil diversity challenge, that investigating that diversity through metagenomics is more complicated than investigating the diversity of our human guts. So that's maybe attractive for a certain public. If it comes to the farmers, the peasants, you said there are good practices that could be shared. Scientists can work in participatory approaches with these farmers and peasants and organize the collection of the data, the validation of the data, to make these data somehow scientific data that can be further used by the scientific community. And this is a way to interact with the farming society, farming community, which is very different from the way to interact with scientists themselves. I remember a few years ago, I'm not a soil scientist myself, but our colleagues here in France produced a map of the richness of DNA in the soils in France. When you suddenly see this map, which is of course partially wrong, because it's only some samples on a systematic grid, you have immediately a sort of idea of, this is soil diversity in France. So what does it mean? And you want to ask questions to them. And the map, for example, is a very simple way to convey the idea that we have a capability to look at this diversity at a not global scale, but at a national scale. And you can attract, for example, decision makers or some other types of scientists. Maybe last point I have in mind, and I know that this happened in some parts of France, I think in Britain, in Rennes. There are also participatory approaches to work with those amateurs who are fond of recording data in the landscape. Well, this is very easy to do with botanists, but that can also be done with people interested in soils. And here again, the new technologies can help discuss and work and interact with another community of people. So my message is that if we want to attract people on these issues of soil biodiversity, we should have in mind that there are different publics and different ways and different tools to interact with these different publics. And I think at this stage, well, there is really there are many avenues that are open for doing that. Maybe last point, this afternoon I think there will be this sort of session. I don't know, I asked Philippe Lemonceau this morning, will this be like a showroom? If you meet people who are interested in new technologies, more in the field of sensors or that kind of technologies, they have showrooms to share with the industry, with the citizens, to share the idea that they have developed new tools that can be used by many people. Well, will this afternoon session be like a showroom where we see the soil and the different techniques and methods that can be used to study it? Or I hope this will be the case. I'm sure this will be the case. But should we have a sort of permanent showroom on this kind of things? Maybe.
Yes, please.
May I mention the role of champions? I think we do underestimate the sort of the good news stories that can come out from our research investigations. And I'll just have a little anecdote from a project that actually it was the first agricultural biodiversity project to be funded by the GEF. It was 1996, it lasted for 6 years, and it was multinational. And our Ghanaian colleagues, so in West Africa, deliberately went out to identify cases of good practice where farmers were the guardians of the biodiversity on the lands that they were farming. And there was one farmer who was growing his yams underneath a dry forest canopy, so he wasn't cutting any trees, and he was growing 27 different varieties of yam, which was mind-blowing, and he knew exactly where to plant them and how to manage them, and indeed how to sell them as well. So they were very marketable. And he became famous, really famous in the local media. He was on the television. The scientists were sort of holding his hand as well and helping to provide some of the scientific explanation of why what he was doing was good. But actually the farmer took the lead there, and he became the real champion of the importance of farmers looking after the biodiversity on their land and how that biodiversity in turn supported their livelihoods. And I see us in being a somewhat analogous position now with soil biodiversity. We need a few champions.
I like the idea of interacting with different audiences, different members of the public. Usually when I go and interview scientists when I'm writing something about their work, I usually start off by saying, pretend I'm a 10-year-old, assume that level of understanding of your work. And I think it's also really great for and then we usually try to work up from there. But I think it would be great for a lot of the young scientists to go into the schools and speak to actual groups of 10-year-olds and explain their work. That way, it gives them a way of talking about the work in a very simple, it sort of trains you to talk about the work in a very simple way that even a very young mind can understand, but it will also educate their teachers. Just one of many ways. So one of the things that the group of young scientists and I talked about is this issue of like coming up with a simple number, or something simple to kind of crystallize the work. So climate scientists have managed to distill a big idea into a little number, the 2 degrees Celsius figure, which is supposed to be the most that global temperature can increase without catastrophe. And much of the public hangs on to that simple number. They don't remember a lot of the rest of it, but they can hang on to that simple number. And somebody here mentioned the biodiversity in the human gut, which is something that I think most of the public was unaware of, this whole thing of the human microbiome, until really in the last decade. But the researchers doing that work have, I think, really grabbed the public imagination with the simple number that for every 1 human cell that we encompass, there are 10 bacterial cells. That's the kind of simple number that the public can really hang on to. So is it possible for soil biodiversity researchers to come up with a similarly simple concept or number? Yes.
Well, I think, as a scientist, I think to come up with a number in relation to diversity, or how much diversity matters, I think would be, I don't know how other people would feel, but I'd feel quite uncomfortable about doing that, really. I don't think we're in a position to be able to do that, and it'll obviously vary. As a scientist, I would say, like we were saying before, it would depend on the actual context that you're in. But there again, people do use figures to capture people's imaginations. I know one that people use is often saying, there's more bacterial cells in a handful of soil than there are people on Earth. And many of us have a colleague who once famously said, "Give me 5 and I'll give you a function," when he was relating to the number of different trophic groups or species within a food web. But I think it's the kind of thing, I suspect, I don't know how other people feel, but I imagine a lot of scientists would feel uncomfortable about being so precise, particularly when we don't actually, we've got a lot to learn really about diversity and function relationships. But I think there are general concepts that could be articulated about the soil microbiome or the soil diversity in its complexity, rather than a number. Because we deal in variability, as was said before, so it's, we naturally, I think, fall back to that.
If I could add on that, one easy example would be to say that while we are all aware of what goes on in our landscape, birds, butterflies, animals, flowers, trees, forests, water, fishes, 25% of all our biodiversity is hidden underground because it is in soil. And to think that every time we have 4 species passing on our visual landscape, one on top of that we just don't know about. This is something to bring soil biodiversity maybe closer. It is true that we need scientists to provide the knowledge base. And unless we have good scientists, and this conference is really a big showcase for excellent science being provided. And let me just thank Philippe Lemonceau for organizing this conference, but not only, for leading this EcoFinder study altogether, which provides excellent science base for our work. But this is one part, and then we need to distill a few examples which can easily be understood by everybody, as you were mentioning, by a 10-year-old. When I am going to brief my political boss, who doesn't necessarily know about my own issues, biodiversity, nitrates, pollution in water, soils, I am always told, Pia, make sure that a 10-year-old will understand it, and then you will get the commissioner's ears.
I'll just add one very quick thing to add to it. I would say certainly in the UK now, and I suspect in other places, when we write grant applications, we are explicitly asked to give a summary which we can communicate to we have 13 as our cut-off age. So we are, increasingly asked to do that at that point, and I think it is increasingly important in terms of just articulating the importance of the work within the scientific community as well, because often you're dealing with scientists from other disciplines as well. So it is something that's becoming more important, and as it gets embedded in the funding culture, it's obviously something people will learn to do more effectively. The only thing I would say from looking at many of these, there must be some very intelligent 13-year-olds around.
Yes, please.
Just going back to the analogy with the 2 degrees target of climate change, I think the strength of that one is that 2 degrees, everybody can kind of relate to it. We kind of, all individuals know roughly what that means, 2 degrees, even if you think, well, 2 degrees extra isn't too bad in terms of direct temperature, but for a global level that resonates with people. In terms of above ground biodiversity, which is also very complex, I think there's an analogy with the farmland bird index or the grassland butterfly index. Indexes which are based on scientific systems, but which are not communicated scientifically, but based on a simple graph and based on birds and butterflies, which again, most people kind of have a feeling with, have an emotion with, understand what it means. They say, well, yeah, I also noticed there's less butterflies than there used to be. Sorry, butterflies again. So I wonder, without being a soil biodiversity scientist, whether there would be a possibility to develop a similar kind of publicly appealing index based on earthworms diversity or something, because also there everybody knows what an earthworm is. There might be a way to communicate in that way as a proxy, I know, because it's not covering all the complexity. Just an idea.
Maybe 2 things. The first is that I would like to comment on the intrinsic difficulty in communicating about biodiversity. I'm not a soil scientist, but I used to work a bit on the assessment of biodiversity using different methods and techniques. And intrinsically, it's difficult to have an equivalent of the 2 degrees mantra and to express it simply in a single figure. This is intrinsic, and this is not related to soil by itself. It's really a sort of difficulty. But nevertheless, you are very much right when you make the analogy with the human microbiome. My colleague Duško Erlich, who is one of the human microbiome leaders in France, he always says, we have an organ which is unknown of 1 to 2 kilograms, where there is a number of genes, which is, I don't remember exactly what, that's 10, not 10, thousands of times what we have, the number of genes that we have as a human individual. So he's able to express very simply the idea that there is a diversity there, which is incredible, fascinating, and that it is important to understand the role of this diversity for our health. So I think for the soil we can do that. Probably we will not speak of an organ, we have to find other images. We have to maybe link that with, as was said, with functions, and say 1 gram of soil, or that is able to do that. I was told before coming here that every 5 to 10 years, if I'm right, the earthworms are able to digest a full soil. Is this true or not? I'm not sure. I'm not a soil specialist. But that kind of images can probably play a role in the expression of simple expressions. Then to transform that into saying what will happen if we continue to have too intensive agricultural practices, what will happen if we continue to transform natural land into artificial land, how much would we lose? Is a bit difficult maybe, but we have to somehow work on that, because this is typically what they have done with the climate. They have said, if we continue that way, well, +2 degrees, these and that consequences will come. So I think this, I agree, there is a challenge here to be met by the soil scientists.
Yeah, just it was said during the conference. In fact, a simple message could be: no soil, no food, no life. We all know that soil support other services than production, but I think the main service is food for people. So without any number, you can say that if you have no soil, no life in soil, then you will have no food. So it's even more simple without any number.
Zero?
Okay. Yes, maybe beyond the figures, we need to think about concepts, because concepts behind biodiversity are moving quite quickly, and we need to help people like teachers to understand and to make them able to explain all these concepts to pupils or young students. We have a very ambitious program in France to help teachers in a long life learning process, to be aware of the last concepts from science, and to promote them to integrate these new concepts and new findings in their day-to-day teaching for pupils and young students. I think it's very important, because behind figures there are concepts, and these concepts are not so evident or obvious, and we need to take care about that, I think.
May I just add one small suggestion? It goes to Diana and the other organizers of the GSBI. Let's have a competition for somebody to come up with the number or the concept or perhaps an image which sums up this problem with soil biodiversity.
I think artwork would be a really great idea. I mean, that's something. It's clear, I think it seems easier to tie the issue of soil biodiversity to food security. I think it's more difficult, or perhaps the connection hasn't been made for the public, and maybe not even within the scientific community, of the connection between soil biodiversity and climate. And I'm wondering if part of that is also a problem that at a policy level and at an NGO level, those two areas are separate. Agriculture is separate from climate. And how can that be addressed? How can people at a policy level who are focusing on agriculture and who are focusing on climate talk to each other and bring in this whole issue of soil biodiversity, which is so important? Yes?
Well, I mentioned champions, but another word is an icon. If you think, what has the panda done for conservation, nature conservation? It certainly has raised the profile of nature conservation, although we as scientists all know that the panda is only just a minor part of it, and what we're really after is habitats. But it's something that's captured people. So what's the icon for soil biodiversity? I'll give you a suggestion: a truffle. Now, here, I mean, we really do value truffles, don't we? So why not something like that? I mean, an earthworm, a lot of people dislike them intensely, but most people love truffles or some other sort of mushroom. And there is a good indicator for soil biodiversity, and maybe raise the profile. There's lots of other icons around, so why don't we have one?
Yes.
Well, when playing with the game, the games on the Epifamily games, in fact, when teachers play with the children, in fact, the icon is the tardigrade. The one shown, the pop star for the children is the tardigrade that was shown by Ben. So it can be also an icon for soil. It's a strange animal. It looks like a beer. Children like beers, so maybe it's a good icon for soil.
Yes, please.
I tried to make the point in my talk about packaging soil biodiversity inside other issues which may be seen as more important, have more appeal, and so on, within food security, climate change, and so on. And although that is in a sense copping out from getting soil biodiversity recognized, really the issue there is that you are working through a chain of communication and understanding, from the scientists working with soil biodiversity to people working with soil or living off soil directly, the farmers and so on and so forth, who need not know about the metagenomics of the microbes, but they do need to know that nitrogen fixation helps and so on and so forth. Up a chain of understanding and communication to people concerned with land use management as a whole, with forestry, with conservation, and with food production in terms of regions and nations and so on, up to the global level where the issues of climate change and total food security and world trade in all the elements which influence it. And somehow getting that message about the icon in the soil up to the level where then the influence begins to trickle back down again to help. And of course it is influenced at all the levels, is something that no person or institution can manage really. But it does mean that the first important step is to persuade the people who are immediately involved, and that's the farmers and the land users. And that is, I think, the scale at which the majority of us can hope to operate. But then it needs a few champions, people of influence to reach, to lift it up the other levels. So, and that depends, it's never too early to start thinking about those things, but it really means influencing those people around you who can reach higher up into the tree. And I think that is something you can start trying to do from quite early on, is to see, there's somebody I know, my father knows, my mother knows, my uncle knows, let's talk to them and try and get them to think about these things.
Pia, please.
Yes, you were trying to make the link with raising awareness for soils in the same way as we could, or scientists did, raise awareness for climate change. I think that, in fact, what was the main idea of raising awareness for climate change was telling us how badly off we would be, that our world temperature would rise by so many degrees. And we do have a similar catastrophic example in mind for soils, which is desertification. It is, and desertification strikes. I would say that for us who are sitting here today, it strikes too far away from where we are today. But none of us would want that desertification strikes here tomorrow. And this is where we could find a hook in explaining desertification means that soil have lost their water and have lost their biodiversity and therefore have lost their capacity to produce food and to feed the people. And this is why then we see also pictures of people starving and people moving, migrating outside the region. So this could be a hook whereby we could plead for biodiversity. And I only support the idea that we need to start to plead for soil biodiversity with the most interested community, which is farming community. Here, starting by where we are today, we are in the middle of the most beautiful agricultural spot, I guess, of this country. And we need to raise awareness, and maybe there is no need to raise awareness of this farming community to the fact that they live in such a beautiful spot, but to the fact that if they don't care for their soil biodiversity also, they will lose the spot altogether.
Is there a way of raising awareness in the public of the kind of agriculture that's practiced that does support the soil biodiversity? I think that there is a disconnect. I think that there's a common idea that people have that we can either have good agriculture, meaning good for the land, or productive agriculture, meaning usually not good for the land. Is there a way, are there better ways of drawing attention to the agriculture that's doing both? Yes, please.
Well, it's really a key question. One way, there are various ways, I think, to answer that. One way is to promote hybridization between researchers, advisors, and farmers, to make them work together to promote kind of reflexive way to make knowledge and to imply farmers and land users in research programs. We have this kind of programs in France, and we try to fund it quite well and to secure these funds. It's not so easy these times, but we have this kind of tools to make this hybridization possible. And there are also networks between farmers and advisors, technical institutes and research institutes for doing this. And one last point is, again, the quick question is also education of future farmers. And we have a big program to renew the curricula of these future farmers or future land users or future advisors. It's very ambitious. And the minister, I think the minister this afternoon, the Minister of Agriculture will be present and will talk about that. We have the ambition to put and to promote ecological concepts, agroecological concepts in curricula from the very beginning of vocational education for 14 to 15 years old students to the PhD students. So it's a big politics we have now, and we hope we will succeed.
Please.
Maybe a thing which is a bit different, but of course farmers are important. Of course there are links between the practices and the diversity in the soils. Of course also we do not know everything about it at this stage. We have simple ideas or guesses, and sometimes we may have different results. I know that, for example, here in Dijon, they have links, established links or relationships between the number of animals and the diversity in the soils. For example, what did we know before they did that in the past? I don't know, but well, we have a lot of things to learn. But so, of course, farming is important. But I think there are two other things I would like to stress. I think one of us spoke also about forestry. I used to be a forester, and I'm still a bit. And I think in France, nearly 1/3 of the country is covered by forest and wood. So I think the diversity of the soil under forest and wood must be also something important. I remember of periods when we had the acidification, acid rains, this kind of a debate we had in the past. And then we had also a lot of work about the acidification due to spruce and the plantations and so and so. So I would like to say that, well, of course, if we look to the planet globally, agriculture is important, agriculture is key, food is very important, but forests must be somewhere also in the picture. And the other point I had in mind is artificialization. Of course, we are speaking of diversity of the soils, but when soil is still here, when you remove soil because you artificialize the country, well, this is a major driver. And last year, exactly 1 year ago, because this was the same day in 2013, we had a meeting on soils, and I was struck by some figures that were given about the speed of the destruction of soils as compared to the time it takes to elaborate a soil from the bedrock. This is not directly linked to biodiversity, but these are major drivers, and we should not forget these major figures. So agriculture, forest, and that artificialization. And then biodiversity also is important, but I think we should keep that also in mind.
Yeah, I was going to say, I go back to what was said earlier. I mean, I think the key, for me anyway, in communicating to farmers, foresters, landowners, is what was said before about having case studies or champions to demonstrate. Because I suspect, it's like what I said in my talk, that policymaker who said to me, if the grass grows, why do I care? And the converse of that is if you can demonstrate that plants grow better under certain management conditions, and that, other factors will obviously be involved other than biodiversity, but the soil biodiversity could be a key component of that. If you can demonstrate that and get key examples or champions to show that in different systems, I suspect, I imagine farmers look over the fence, and if they see someone else's maize is growing better than it is in there, that's what will motivate them, I think. The other thing I just wanted to say about communicating soil biodiversity is that I think, a lot of the focus is on the users, the farmers, etc. But I think that the general public, I wonder in many cases, are also just fascinated by discovery. And I think what the soil holds is the potential to reveal, quite remarkable biotic interactions, the sheer diversity of organisms. That's what motivates a lot of scientists, I think, is coming across publications that show some new kind of interaction between different organisms that impact on a plant growth, or interactions between an above-ground herbivore, for example, that impacts on soil organisms or something like that. These sort of fascinating discoveries. And I think a lot of the attention that's given to science is often through fundamental discoveries, rather than necessarily through their application. So I think there's a lot that can still be done in that area too.
Yes, I just want to add a little point which was stimulated by the mention of forestry here, is that Edmundo Barrios is here from the World Agroforestry Center, and one of the practices, or the range of practices promoted by his work and that of his colleagues is of growing crops with trees in various components. And one of the phrases they've used in that, which I think is very good, is fertilizer trees. And the concept that trees fertilize the soil and therefore also promote of course, soil biodiversity is, I think, a nice little concept. And of course, it applies also to the use of legume cover crops and other such practices. So I think nesting, I keep flogging this issue, I suppose, of nesting the soil biodiversity into other things which people are more likely to latch on is very important. And trees, almost everybody, I think, likes trees and supports the idea of more trees around and so on. And I think, you know, trees and earthworms go together, trees and truffles go very closely together, and I think there's probably a good point there in the issue of promoting practices which in themselves serve the purposes of soil biodiversity.
Yes, please.
Just to add a comment to Richard's previous remark, I was very impressed by the results of the Eco-Finders project because they discovered a lot of new species in European soils, meaning that you don't have to go to rainforests, to exoplanets, just European soils. We have plenty of maybe new species, and this can be communicated also to large public, saying that you don't need to go very far deep in the ocean, just under your feet. You may have many numerous species, unknown species, and that's, I think, a huge result of the Eco-Finders project, meaning that we don't know actually what is under our feet. And we send satellites, and we don't actually know what is under our feet. So I think it can be communicated to a large public, this kind of results.
And one more element, in order to communicate this, we also need to raise awareness to the fact that if we continue sealing our soil, we will definitely lose what is beneath it. And if we continue pretending that we all need our small house with our small terrace, with our small way which is paved to reach our own house, we will simply destroy biodiversity, and by destroying means that it will most likely not come back again. This is one element. However, this is so very difficult to communicate that, to give you an example which is very close to me and which is a typical negative example, we tried in the European Union during 7 years to promote an agreement on a framework legislation addressing soil issues in Europe. And during 7 years, nobody wanted, or it is not true that nobody, because many member states wanted this legislation, but some did not, and we could not achieve the goal of having it. And at the end of the day, with immense frustration, we decided, okay, if you don't want it, we withdraw it. So, but this being said, we are now starting work to look at how what do we need to make it better so that it can be accepted next time around.
And two suggestions to put soil biodiversity on the map. One is to actually use the carbon debate. You know, we are invited, whenever we book an air ticket, for example, you're invited to offset your carbon footprint. It's something that's entered the public consciousness a lot. So I think carbon is one area. And secondly, to develop good news stories. I get worried when we are asked to promote crisis stories, you know, about how everything's going down the drain, and because manifestly we've been wrong in the past, and we've exaggerated. Hyperbole has been used about the environmental crisis, where again manifestly it was wrong. So I like the other side of the coin, the good news stories, because they're provable. They're provable through anecdotes, such as the one I gave earlier, but they're also provable that, you know, that there are real benefits, and we can put numbers to those benefits and make them seem tangible and really real, that soil biodiversity is a good thing.
Another 20 minutes.
While you look for your question, can I add just one point, if I may? Perhaps a different point of view in terms of this raising awareness with the general public. Indeed, good practice examples, fantastic. There is labels, there's certificates already and so on. But what I was thinking is actually pretty sad that we have to ask this question, that we have to promote practices which support life, whereas actually the dominant practice is to kill life, as we kind of seen in this conference. It's sad that we have to work on a very small scale with excellent puppetry examples I've shown for educating farmers and so on, while actually there is a very strong power from agribusiness, I think. And that, I think, is the hampering part in the whole discussion, the pricing system of products which come from say soil biodiversity friendly products versus the very intensive agriculture. And that's something we cannot resolve here, I'm afraid, but I think it's a very important component.
Okay, I want to jump ahead to a question that I don't want to let get away from us in the remaining minutes of the discussion. Where do policymakers believe soil biodiversity scientists should focus their research now and in the next 5 years, and how do insights from soil biodiversity inform your decisions? So I'd like to start with Pia.
Well, one issue which we need if we want to make the case for soil is to have good soil indicators. And definitely, why am I saying this? It is very easy to have a GDP. GDP, everybody understands. The man on the street knows that if our GDP is increasing, I will be better off, for instance. He doesn't know how the GDP is formed. And if we want to make the case for biodiversity overall, but for soil biodiversity in particular, we need to have something which we can sell in inverted commas. And a soil indicator, is our soil improving? Is it better off? Is its quality less good? This is something where we need to improve our work. We are now working on mapping of ecosystems. This is work which is going on and which could pave the way for establishing indicators for ecosystems, but in particular indicators for soil. So if I have a wish for the coming 5 years, do work on indicators for soil.
Francois.
Maybe the way we try to answer your question, that I would like to say a few words. First way in France, but I assume that may exist in other countries, we have established what we call a group of scientific interest with different organizations, ministries, environment, INRA, of course, but ADEM, the organization of Antonio Bispo, the national service which is in charge of geography in France. So we have different organizations that have put their strengths together to produce maps and indicators. I think this is something that is important. This is one way of doing things. Last week, if I'm right, or the week before, we also started another type of group of scientific interest, which is about the change of uses of soils. It's more about land use than about soils itself. But of course, the changes of uses of the land use will have a strong impact on the soil. And here again, this has to be done with the different organizations working together. And so this is a second way of doing things. Under these systems, we have, for example, in France, this monitoring system network of the quality of soils. And I think also this is typically kind of tool that can be used to answer the question you raised. So I think we have different ways to produce indicators, to produce maps, to produce simple images that can help understand the changes, well, in that case, at the French level. And again, I mentioned that earlier in the discussion, to have a map is a key. A map, a simple map. You have a lot of things that are conveyed through a map. I know this is, sometimes it seems a bit old-fashioned, but I think a lot of things are conveyed through maps. So 3 examples of things that we do or we intend to do.
Cyril.
Yes, maybe some things a bit different. I think indicators, observatories, networks are very important, and we are agree to fund this kind of actions. I think we also need impacts of research. I think François will be agree with me. We need to promote innovation. What is innovation? Is a good idea, is a knowledge put into practice with success. So we need to promote how to translate what is soil biodiversity, what is soil functioning, into real new practices at the field level. Well, in fact, it's research between soil science, agronomy, and ecology. We need to make these communities much more closer, especially with agronomists, because they have to design how farmers or practitioners have to invent or to use new practices at the field level that promote agricultural production, which is very important, and soil fertility and soil durability.
And I'd like to turn that question around a little too. How can, and hear from the scientists in the group, how can government and policymakers support this growing science of soil biodiversity?
Well, I think give us more money would be good, but we would always say that. Well, I think, for me, I think there needs to be a balance between innovation and application. And it's very important to apply the knowledge, and there's a lot of activity in those areas now. But I think a key message I would like to say is that as scientists, one of the things we're exploring is these very complex systems. There are many questions remaining. And I think the science, the fundamental science that will be done now will lead to innovations in the future which can be applied to situations, agricultural or forestry situations. So I think there needs to be a balance between the two. I think the other thing is that, I mean, some of us were having a conversation before. I mean, I don't know if there are any crop breeders in the audience, for example. And it's these kind of interactions that are probably, in my view, going to lead to the innovations, because you can't look at soil biodiversity in isolation. You need to look at biodiversity in relation to the actual crops, and it's the crops and the roots of those crops that are likely to lead to the changes in the soil organisms that are going to have the benefits for crop growth. So I think we need to collaborate more with different disciplines. Soil physics is another key area, I think. It was mentioned in the discussions. We, as soil scientists working on organisms, need to consider the physical environments of the soil, which regulates the flow of water to plants, nutrients to plants, and the fluxes of gases. So I think there needs to be a combination of innovation. I think we need to be more multidisciplinary in our approaches, because that will feed the application of the science in the future.
Mike?
Yes, the first thing I'd like to say in that is to follow up on something which I think Michael Stocking said earlier, is the first thing, or to put on one side something which is one of the blockages, and that is the possibility that it's a sort of adversarial situation between the scientist feeling the policymakers are not taking any notice of you, which I may have given the impression myself, and the other way round, that the policymakers think, oh, just those scientists are just going to ask for some more money and say we need to do more research. And what I think is very encouraging in the answers we've been hearing here, but is that the second thing I think is the creation of the means of communication, and of what you're saying about having groups of people coming together and bringing together different disciplines within the advisory situation is extremely important, because I think one of the most difficult things in the communication of science is how science is split up into very separate and very specialized disciplines. And we think within those disciplines, even though we use material from other sciences, and even though the questions we are asking about biodiversity being taken seriously is fundamentally an economic question. It's a scientific question, but it's also an economic question. We're not in the right context of contact very often, and bringing scientists in and bringing them in from a young age into the debates which surround policy, I think is a key issue, where it's reaching, if I can put it that way, reaching down as well as us trying to reach up into the situation.
So I wanted to get back then to another question about developing. Is it possible to develop simple guidelines for managing soil and its biodiversity in a variety of microclimates? And also, how does the assessment of global soil biodiversity that's going on advance that and complement it? Yes, please.
I could just have a go at the first part, and I think Anthony's presentation put his finger on some issues here that are important, and that is finding simplified or generalizations out of what is being found in the scientific process that can be used in management more readily. And he was talking about standards, he showed the example of earthworms and so on. In my talk, I showed a diagram of a decision tree for selecting the appropriate organic matter to use in given situations. And that was a tool we tried to develop, and which has had a certain measure of success. And I think there are things which can be derived relatively quickly out of information which is already there, as long as we get away from the it depends what you mean by, and well, it only works in that tiny little bit of area. And I think soil management is a fairly coarse procedure as a whole. You do it, I mean, we saw that dramatic film that Kate Scow showed, and what is done across a huge field is one thing. What can be done mound by mound in a sweet potato field is another thing. But there are manipulations of soil biology which could be much more readily put into relatively straightforward management tools, I believe.
As a simple indicator, we saw yesterday a movie with a farmer with a spade, just digging the soil, looking at the soil, looking at the structure of the soil. It's a simple indicator, but it gives you an idea of how the soil is actually functioning, if it's stable or not. So it's a simple indicator just with a spade. It's quite easy to do. You have also, if you want to go to soil biodiversity indicators, you also have very simple methods to extract earthworms just with mustard. We are in Dijon, so we can use mustard from Dijon. And you can extract the earthworms just with the mustard and count the earthworms. It gives you an indication of how many earthworms are present. So we have actually simple indicators to control the effect of the practices that farmers may use for that. And if they are changing their practices, then there may be an evolution, they may see an evolution of their soil. But just with a spade, it's enough. When you discuss with farmers that are involved in conservation agriculture, they always have a spade in the tractor. So they always have a spade with them to look at their soils. In fact, they told you that they are more time with the spade on the field looking at the soil than in their tractor or in the machines. So. Yeah, we already have simple indicators, but I would join what was previously said, that we know more or less the big drivers to modify biodiversity. But then it's how to apply those methods on very specific situations. Because if we said to a farmer, well, the only way is to go to no-till, so it's very difficult to jump from tillage to no-till without changing all the system, the rotation, the crops, etc. So we have to find step-by-step intermediate actions that each farmer can use. If he wants to go to no-till, then okay. But we have to identify small steps also, not only big drivers and big changes.
Yeah, please.
Just to follow up on what you said, one other element is to help also engineering research, because we could probably develop also new technologies in terms of tractors, in terms of other machineries, which would contribute to preserving biodiversity in soils, in agricultural soils, in forest soils, rather than deleting everything as soon as they pass by to do their own work for which they were designed. I think that in agriculture we have developed a lot of new technologies in terms of making our machinery more efficient, using less petrol, doing more with one only machine. But in terms of being more efficient for the soil biodiversity itself, we have not moved. This is one term which we could improve in terms of indicators. One other element I think will be presented this afternoon, and I want to publicize because it is our joint research center at the European Commission has produced a soil atlas. And this is something which also can help in communicating and in making the case for where we stand on our soils and what should be in an ideal world. Where do we want to move towards to? So this is another important element that we should make best use of also.
I'll just say something very briefly about an assessment. I guess the value, to build on that, the value of an assessment is it gives a consensus and a baseline on the diversity of soils or the knowledge we have, not just on one or two groups, but on the range of organisms. And it provides a baseline for identifying future threats and future trends in response, and also a baseline, I would say, for being able to identify ways of intervening through management to yield benefits for diversity in different locations.
All right, well, at this point, this discussion has been all about moving towards the future and translating science into good policy and good practices, and I want to invite three of the brilliant young early career scientists who helped develop all these questions and who wrote the statement. They are coming up to join the panel and deliver some of their thoughts. So Kelly, and Marta, and Alberto. And I'm just going to turn it over to them. They can pose questions, comment on any of the points that have been raised.
Okay, hello everyone. First of all, I just wanted to say briefly, as Philippe mentioned before, so this initiative that we formed, the Early Career Scientists, is right now we're a group of 31 people, but that's by no means a final list. So, and I know there are many of you out there who have not joined yet, so get in touch with us, definitely. And I would actually be interested in, because these questions were formed by a group, by the 31 early career scientists, and I wanted to actually ask if we could open the floor to the audience for questions, to the panel, because I'm sure there are plenty more questions out there.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions that they maybe sent to us that you felt didn't get answered, or you have additional questions to add?
This is not so much a question. I would like to disagree with the statement that was made by the panel very early on and hasn't been challenged since. And this is this idea that we cannot communicate the beauty and interest of soil organisms to the general public. So we dismissed that idea out of hand. And I think that this is not only not true, but also, I think, potentially very dangerous to the whole cause of promoting soil biodiversity in agriculture, in policy, and in science. Now, I don't know if I'm allowed to do a show of hands here, but who here thinks that soil organisms are either amazing, fascinating, or beautiful? There you go. Okay, who doesn't? No. The next question would be, have you ever shown a soil organism to somebody else who has never seen that before? Okay, hands up for that. Okay. With all of you people, did they think it was amazing, fascinating, or beautiful? Hands up. This is your answer, and this is important because the people who aren't soil scientists, who aren't farmers, especially in the developed world, are the taxpayers who fund who vote in the politicians and who fund their industries, who buy the products that support the whole economy. And if they don't care, then we will never get the funding we need for science, and we'll never get the interest, especially in the developed world, to promote agriculture and land management that actually works with the soil biodiversity. So if you ever have any comments on that, I'd be interested to hear. Thank you.
I'm really glad. Is this working? I'm really glad you said that, because we all leaned over to each other and kind of were like, we kind of disagree with that. And we had our recent Central Park study showed even if you can't see the organism, microbes, people can't see them, but people are still really excited to learn about them. I think the Human Microbiome Project, they're really kind of using microbes, and they're moving forward with that, and we can kind of use that, what they've gone forward with. So thank you for bringing that up.
Just a comment? Just a comment. I agree with you, because when we developed the game with Stephen, in fact, the designer that drew the game, or that organized the pictures and the text, she told us that those animals, she didn't know those animals before. She told us those animals are beautiful and children will like it. You know why? Because it looks like dinosaurs, and children like dinosaurs and like monsters. So I agree with you.
It's great to know the passion is still alive.
I do have a slightly self-critical comment, and the extinguished panel has been discussing a lot of what could be done, what should be done. But I'm afraid that many soil microbiologists or soil biologists are a bit introverted instead of being extroverted. And I'm continuing with the questions as you did. There was a project when a cyclist went from Central Europe to East Asia, picking up soil samples every day. And these soil samples were taken from the thread of his bicycle tire. And this was kind of a study aimed at linking art with science. And I think it exciting results. It was not scientifically very deep, but it was something that could attract the audience, attract the public. Do you believe, or who believes that it was able to publish this in a soil biology journal? Who believes that? Okay, there are a few. It is not possible. So we should be more going outwards ourselves and accepting things that are not so deeply scientific as that what we usually do have. Thank you.
Oh, okay.
Maybe that work. Yeah. Maybe one comment about what has been said. I remember there have been books about, for example, the fractal beauty of nature. I'm wondering whether there is a book, I'm not a soil scientist myself, about the beauty of soils. I understand your point, but it's up to you to do this, to write it. So that's a part of the challenge. My point earlier was to say that it's much easier, probably, or evident, or to do that for coral reef fishes. So it's up to you to produce a book about the beauty of soils. That this is one thing. Second thing I shared with my neighbor during the talk is that all of us were fascinated in the recent period by Philae, you know, this comet and this thing. So what kind of travel would you like to propose to us? Scientific travel. I think that can be done. For example, we can speak about the complexity of nature of soils, but it's somehow up to the scientific community to propose such a story. It's probably not someone from the European Commission or from a research organization that will propose that. It's somehow up to the scientific community to imagine the story to be told. So I think that would be, I agree, nice challenge.
Over here now? Or, yeah, with the mic.
Yes. So, I am sorry that I have to point out an absence. And since I've taken in the lessons that we have to address a 10 years old audience, I'm going to try to explain that to a 10 years old audience. So in the soil, we have listened in this Congress, we have had a lot of talks about what is in the soil. So you have little tiny things, billions of them that are called bacteria. And you have little billions of very thin threads that comes from the mushrooms, and you have, of course, the plant roots. But in the water that is trapped between the soil grains, you have lots of organisms that are just slightly larger than the bacteria that swim in this space. And there are also billions of them, and they feed on bacteria and they feed on fungi. So will the biodiversity picture be complete, ignoring those organisms that are called protists? That is my question. And now I'm addressing the scientific, and I'm saying, you probably remember from your study, the ecology lessons, this graphic of Lotka Volterra. They were studying the population of rabbits, and they noticed that there were huge fluctuation in the population of rabbits, and they couldn't understand them. And they could only understand them when they looked at the population of foxes. And you probably remember that the population of foxes were increasing and the population of rabbits were decreasing. So can we understand the relationship? Can we understand the structure of the bacterial and fungal population without looking at their major predators? And yeah, I listened to all the talks, and I realized that protists were mostly absent. And it's not because there are not studies of protists. Of course, we still don't have the toolkits that are available for studying bacteria with high throughput sequencing, and that is because of the immense genetic variability of the protists. The protists encompass such a huge variety of organisms that are not related between themselves that we still don't have the molecular tool to study them.
Thank you for your protest comment. And we actually got quite a few people who came up to the organizers and us talking about how protests seem to be left out of this conference. And I don't think it was it definitely wasn't intentional. And actually, I think there were quite a number of protest people here. And we even I invited a protest person for my data workshop at the beginning, and she said, I don't work in soils all the time. I'm mostly aquatic. But I was really excited to bring her here to see what people were doing with DNA sequencing and protists, and use her information and her knowledge of the protists in the aquatic world and apply to our soil sequencing questions. So I appreciate your comment, and I think that now, as we move forward, especially with the GSBI, keeping that on our list of like, okay, we're making sure we're representing everyone, every taxonomic group in the soil. On that note, I actually thought you were going to point out something else. To the panel, we've noticed that there's a gender bias, which we did not have, I think, during the week. We had our speakers were quite balanced, and it was an interesting thing, and maybe something I have found when I go to more policy-focused talks that tends to be an issue. So something for the panel maybe to comment on, or actually I thought that's what the question was going to be. Protests were ignored here today, and
You want us to respond about protests? Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll just make a point about that, I mean, I think there is scientifically clear recognition that predators play a major role in food web structure, and they can lead to trophic cascades, and I would agree emphatically that to understand how soil food webs control processes, you need to look at predation in those systems. I mean, I think there's no question about that, really. On the gender balance, I thought you selected the actual panel. Oh. Can I make a point about the point about publicising just before in that question, because I wanted to say something about the science, because I mean I agree entirely, which is why I made the point about the fascination of those systems and the scientific discoveries, and we shouldn't lose sight of that, and I think that's extremely important. But I do still think if we want to broaden the appeal, I mean, we're a biased audience basically, and I think if we want to broaden that appeal, I mean, certainly from my own experience of teaching and communicating with school children, etc., I still think if you can have a concept for them to attach to first, to take them into the soil, you've got a better chance of embracing more people within that. I mean, that can be a very simple concept. It can be art, it can be the way you write, it can be a general concept, but I still think the more we can sort of bring people in more broadly and capture them into the soil system, the better chances we have of making that. But I think the point you make is exactly true.
Just one thing. In the atlas there will be, that I'm working on, there will be 5 pages on protists, and just 2 pages on bacteria. So we are taking care of protists.
I also wanted to respond to the person who brought up that soil biodiversity should be fascinating. It is fascinating. You know, I go out and talk about my book to a lot of different audiences, and people are fascinated that there's this hidden world beneath our feet that we thought was dead. It was hard, solid ground. It's nothing. It's dirt. And when they start to understand, at least to the extent that I understand, how incredibly alive it is, how much is going on down there, people are just fascinated. So I think that there should be many, many ways of making that world, of opening up that world to the greater public, not just farmers. You know, I think it's something that could interest everybody.
Yes, I want to comment something about the indicators. There are a group of scientists that we have already developed some of the indexes. There is an Erdon index, and there are different indexes. So we have already worked on that. It's just maybe they are not accessible or not are not in the farmer's hands. But I have a question that maybe is a little difficult to answer. How to sensibilize the leaders of big enterprises, herbicides enterprises, pesticides enterprises that, well, it seems they are not conscious of the importance of soil biodiversity.
I'm quite not sure about that, because They are developing new molecules because a lot of molecules are banned because they are reinvestigated and some are banned. And then they are developing more and more the biocontrol biomolecules. So I think they are now more and more interested in soil biodiversity because maybe it's a source of new products for them to control pathogens or etc. So to develop biocontrol pesticides, for example. So I think they are moving on that direction now.
If I can answer both your questions. On the first on indicators, maybe there are indicators, but what we need, what you could help us doing, is to share indicators and to come to a small set of indicators which are recognized globally, because this is what makes the strength of indicators, that everybody works by the same indicators. And on the second issue, we could try, and all of us could try to take it from a different perspective, because industry, enterprise, always adapts to the needs of the market. So if the market requests pesticides, it will produce pesticides. But the day the market will not request pesticides, industry will adapt and will find other ways of selling and of producing their products.
Yes, and in the same idea, it's why I talk about impact. We need to demonstrate that new solutions, new practices, new ways to do are efficient. Efficient for environment, efficient for farmers, but economically efficient. And if it's efficient, markets and producers and so on can adapt and use these new ways to do. Antonio spoke about biocontrol recipes or solutions. That's right, that very big new companies that are devoted to pesticides are now looking quite closely at these solutions because farmers tried them and it works. So there is a market now. But to make them really open to new solutions, we have to demonstrate that it is economically a way to do.
One more comment?
No, but just I wanted to follow up on this idea of biocontrol. Why do the industry become interested in biocontrol? Because there is a market that is growing up, which is very small at this stage, very small. But they see that there is a future in this market. They see that this market will exist because there are policies, because they understand that the public and the society are concerned, and also because they also, from the scientific community, they see that there are some opportunities coming. We are not in the same stage as we were maybe 10 years ago in terms of knowledge on the way the different metabolites play a role or that. So this is a sort of momentum that is being gained, which is coming both from the scientific community and also from the general public and the market. Very true. And on the point that was made by Pierre Boussello about the indicators, we need to scale. I know that the indicators are wrong, too simplistic, not scientifically enough based. This was clearly said by our colleague when he said we have to express the things simply. But at one point of time, if we want to have something which is equivalent to the 2 degrees which are dear to our to Christine, we need to have indicators that we are able to scale up. If we are not able to scale up the indicators up to national, European or world level, simply nobody will buy them. That's we have to do it. Although they are not pure science, clearly.
At this point, I'm afraid we have to conclude. Thank you to the members of the panel for coming. Thank you to the early career scientists for conceiving of this whole discussion and setting the framework for it. And thank you to the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative for launching this entire effort.